So this video is going to be about the PFL, and to be honest with you guys, it could be a really long one because I'm not going into this video with a script. I'm not really even going into this video with a very significant idea of what I'm going to say, but long story short, just to give a bit of an early abstract, I'm going to talk about the PFL, what I think they're doing correctly, what I think they continue to improve on, and how I think that the PFL could fit in the world of MMA, especially now that the UFC, you could make a small argument, might not be in the strongest position that it has been before. Yes, the UFC is dominating the market of MMA. It's not even close. I know the PFL is trying to sell themselves as this co-leader. They're trying to be a co-leader. It's just not really going to happen. I don't think you can beat the UFC in this MMA market. They just have such a massive share of it. They do have literally every single casual MMA fan watches the UFC. There aren't really MMA fans anymore. There are UFC fans, and I'm going to talk about in this video what I think the PFL can do to maybe win over that market and how I view the casual MMA fan market now that I have actually started to experience the real world a little bit and hang out with MMA fans in the real world throughout my own friends, because typically, I don't know if you guys knew this about me, when I watch MMA fights, I usually watch them in my bedroom all by myself. I don't watch them with other people. Like MMA is like everything to me. Like, it's my income. It was my sport at one point when I was trying to pursue it before injuries got in the way. It was everything to me. So I never really connected with the casual MMA fan base, and I feel like now I have a little bit more of a perspective of what they view. And what I want to say right now is there are no casual MMA fans. Casual MMA fans are UFC fans, and the PFL needs to try and figure out how they can captivate that market as well as the hardcore market, because I think that a lot of hardcore MMA fans, from what I've seen in discourse online, are no longer as interested in the PFL as they were a couple of years ago. So pretty much this is a video talking about what I think that they can do, what I think they've done well, what I think they can continue to do. And let's just kind of start off where I think the PFL sits in the world of MMA, because this is a very hot take by me. This is something that I've said before. This is something that I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with. I quite regularly make the argument that I don't think the PFL is the number 2 promotion in the world. I think you could argue they're number 3. I think you could argue they might be number 4. That number 2 spot could go to Octagon. That number 2 spot could go to Ryzen. That number 2 spot could go to One Championship, even though, once again, hot take, I don't view them as an MMA promotion. They just do kickboxing really at the moment, and grappling and other things. But the point is, I think that you could argue Octagon is one of the biggest promotions in the world. They recently sold, they claim to have sold 59,000 tickets in 2024 for Octagon 62. They quite regularly do put events on in stadiums. It is quite ridiculous how big Octagon's ticket sales can be. They've been doing events in pretty massive arenas like the UFC does. And just in general, we do see Octagon do numbers, man. They have people showing up and showing out. So you could look at that. You could look at Ryzen as well. Ryzen's been doing very well recently. Entertainment value for Ryzen is off the charts. And maybe they've got the hardcore MMA market over the PFL. But I want to talk about this. So why do casual MMA fans watch the UFC? And I think the argument really is just because of the name value, really, because it's so accessible. But also a lot of casual MMA fans in general and hardcore MMA fans as well. This does not just go to casuals, and it is kind of true. Well, it is true. The UFC has the best talent in the world, but I don't think that it would be impossible for the PFL to match the UFC in terms of talent in certain weight divisions. And what I mean by that is there are still some very, very strong fighters out there. And albeit you can't just sign someone off the regional scene right now, go to ACA and sign someone and put them in there with the UFC champion and they're going to win. But what I'm trying to say is you can look at upcoming prospects that the UFC is choosing to ignore and over time build them to be a dominant force. And maybe then you can look at parallels and make arguments that you've got the best fighter. Because I think at the moment, the best example of this is Usman Nurmagomedov. He's 21-0. He's very, very good. Obviously, he is a Nurmagomedov fighter as well. And a lot of people are making strong claims that Usman could step into the UFC's lightweight division and be top 5, top 10. That's probably your best example of that. I did strongly believe that Shamil Musayev could be one of those guys until he did lose a couple of weeks ago. But once again, you sign this guy that the that the UFC don't want. There was a lot of things actually in the background why they didn't want him. But you sign him, you build him up. You make a name out of him, you can make an argument. Salamat Uzbalayev. Now, this is me probably revealing stuff that I shouldn't know. The UFC didn't want him. The UFC did not want to sign him. The UFC seems to believe they've got too many of these fighters from Kazakhstan, from Russia, and they just don't want more fighters from that area of the world. Uzbalayev's not even a wrestler. This guy's a finisher. He's a demon. He just smoked Jesus Pinedo, who's a PFL champion in the first round. It is insane how good this guy is. And that's another example. You give this guy 5 years, maybe Uzbalayev could be an undefeated fighter in 5 years. You can make him argument you've got one of the best featherweights in the world. Puya Ramani, strong example of this. Elite grappler. Give him a few years to develop. Once again, you could probably put Puya Ramani head to head in a few years with the UFC's heavyweight division and claim you've got the best guy. Same as Abu Magomedov, same as Renat Kavalov. The point goes on. So the point is, I think that the PFL is doing the right thing in signing elite talent. They are signing elite talent that the UFC does not want. The UFC didn't want Lazy King. They didn't want Musayev. They didn't want Uzbalayev. And I can tell you this right now as well. I'm pretty confident there is other fighters out there that the UFC just is not interested in, that the PFL could go out there and pick up, including the American fighter Mitchell McKee. You could even chuck Fumi Nkuta in this list as well. To the UFC, it's publicly known the UFC doesn't want Fumi Nkuta on their roster. The PFL should sign him. He's an elite prospect. Mitchell McKee, an example of an elite prospect. 8-0 in the LFA. One of the best prospects in America right now. The PFL has signed him. And obviously, once again, if you give this guy time and he ends up being a developing prospect, you can make that strong argument that you've got one of the more elite prospects in the world. But I kind of just wanted to go back to that example of what the PFL is doing correct, because that's what they're doing right. I know there's probably more sort of like things that I'm not aware of, like managerial agreements, like maybe even political agreements with the funding and things like that. But the PFL signing guys that the UFC does not want from countries that the UFC does not want to look into, that is the right thing to do at the moment. You're taking away talent that the UFC cannot end up signing, because someone like Puya Ramani is an elite prospect. Like, he just is elite. He is very, very good for heavyweight. In fact, it's unbelievable how good he is for that weight class. Another thing as well that you could be arguing that is the right thing that they're doing is you're signing former UFC fighters and you're putting them in there with your prospects. And if your prospects beat them, then all of a sudden you can say, oh, look, our fighters are as good as UFC fighters. If Johnny Eblin beats Brian Battle, if Alexei Progande beats Julio Arce, you could even go down to Kazuba, maybe even beating Natan Schultz, even though he's not a UFC fighter. Ignore that. There's no way Jaro Hussein Al-Salawi's beating Josh Friend, I don't think. But, like, once again, you look at this and you could say these are recent UFC guys that got cut. If your fighters beat them, you could then make an argument, oh, hey, our talent does stack up to the UFC level talent. Look at who we've got. We've just got Progande, who is a homegrown PFL prospect, and he just beat Julio Arce, who had a pretty long career in the UFC of 10 fights. In fact, a winning career in the UFC as well. And he's 7-0 in the PFL. This is a guy that built up from the beginning. Maybe you could do the Bellator move and build up guys from 0 to 100 like you did with AJ McKee, even though that only worked for AJ McKee. It didn't really work for anyone. Once again, a good example of them signing guys that the UFC didn't want. It's not that the UFC didn't want him. It's that the UFC didn't offer him enough money. Paul Hughes, one of the biggest names, if not maybe the biggest name, popularity-wise, worldwide, in the world outside of the UFC. Just had 2 very close competitive fights with Usman Nurmagomedov, who I just said is someone that you can make a claim as your best fighter, someone that can be head-to-head with the UFC's lightweight division, which is a strong division no matter where, and has wins over guys in the UFC as well, which I think is important to note as well. And like, you're signing guys that the UFC aren't taking. Edward Vartanyan would be a good example of this as well. That's someone who I was thinking of. You've got Archie Colgan. I think he's very marketable in his own way. But yeah, I feel like that's what you've got to do if you are the PFL. Another thing the PFL have done recently that is very good is their ranking system. They're no longer doing the silly tournament. That stupid little tournament went for too long. You burned millions and millions of dollars on that stupid tournament that no one watched, no one wanted, no one liked. And it was silly. It was silly. Now you've got a legitimate ranking system, a ranking system that makes sense. If you can somehow get rid of Francis Ngannou, who's absolutely burning a hole in the PFL's funding right now, I think that the PFL could have a pretty strong base to take on the UFC, because let's talk about the UFC right now, man. What's going on with the UFC? The cards we've been getting recently are not as good as the cards that we got in the pay-per-view era. Now, I know, from the fans' perspective, we don't have to pay for the pay-per-views anymore, unless you live in New Zealand. In fact, I do, and I got cucked. It's actually worse for me. Significantly worse than it was in the ESPN era. Oh my goodness, I do miss it now. But the point is, these cards aren't as strong. UFC 326 coming up. This is a weird card. You know, like, aside from the main card, there's no name value here for casual fans to look at. Now, I can tell you right now, these fights are going to be bangers. This matchmaking is fire for what they've got on there. But this is not like high name value fighters that the card's been loaded up. And that's what you need to do if you're the PFL. You need to build up name value so you can have cards that can compete with a card like this, which is seen as a weaker numbered event, which is supposed to be the elite events of the UFC. Just in general as well, the fight nights, the Apex fight nights, the Apex slop has always been quite weak. This is a good example of it. A lot of debuting guys, a lot of people that people don't know. The UFC also takes weeks off on occasion as well. That's something that the PFL has failed to do time in and time again, and now you're not going to get an opportunity to do that. Where was a card on February 14th on Valentine's Day? I don't care that it was on Valentine's Day. Why did you not get a card on here in between Batista Oliveira and Strickland Hernandez? Why do you not have a card prepared for the next break, which could potentially be in early May? Why are we not looking at these dates and saying this is when we need to do it? Because we are not going to have a UFC break for so long now, and you're going to have to compete with the UFC every single weekend now until the UFC decides to take a break. It's insane to me that the PFL's scheduling does not kind of revolve around this. But at the same time, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, I think as well that's what I was trying to go with the Tajikistan thing. Actually, my search history has the university that I attend in it, so I can't actually bring that up. Not for any other reasons, obviously, but Tajikistan, dude. Sign fighters from Tajikistan, sign fighters from Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, because when the UFC had Nurul Aliyev make his debut in the promotion, people from Tajikistan huddled around him in a way that they organized an event in a field to watch the UFC card in person. Not in person, sorry, in person, like in front of a TV. I had an image of it. Oh, just so dumb that I've removed it. Give me a sec. I'm going to bring it up actually so you can see what I'm talking about. And it turns out it's not there. But anyways, we've brought it back up here. This is what I mean. This is when Nurul Aliyev made his UFC debut. The people of Tajikistan huddled around. They had a screen playing as well. Like, it was insane. And the UFC since did make a lot of signings. I think they signed 4 or 5 fighters from Tajikistan in that year. However, they haven't done it since, really. And there are really good fighters from Tajikistan still out there that can be signed, that you could make a pretty big name out of, and get the fighters from countries or groups of people that are so passionate. Because, like, as much as it is good to try and captivate the American audience, the UFC has the American audience. You know, they've got them. KSW has the Polish audience. I mean, Ryzen has the Japanese audience. You could try and tap into that market too, because the UFC has, but also kind of has failed to do so. You could look into the Chinese audience. There's so many MMA fighters in China that would benefit from the PFL spotlight. There's a lot of these niche audiences that are passionate about MMA that haven't really been tapped into by the UFC, and I think like Tajikistan is a perfect example of that. They had thousands of people gathering to watch this fight on a screen. Imagine if you can get thousands of people from a country guaranteed to watch your card because you've just built up a fighter from that area. I know that the PFL does have fighters from Tajikistan, but that's something that they could try and capitalize on even more. I don't even know like the economic situation or the political situation or the geographical situation, but I mean, like, could you do a card in Tajikistan and it be profitable? I don't know. I know that over there in that sort of area of the world, there's probably a lot of things going on, but you know what I mean? Like, you've got to look into these markets. Could you do a card in Japan? Is the PFL even known in Japan? Japan loves fights. Could you do a card in China? I know the UFC's been struggling to get a card in China. Can the PFL do it? I don't know. These are just things that I think you should look into. Selfishly, New Zealand is not going to get a UFC card anytime soon from the UFC. The PFL could try and take the New Zealand market, but I think that's probably a bit small. Not many people live in New Zealand. But the point still stands. So you got to kind of look at these places that the UFC doesn't have tapped and then try and get into those, and then you can try and broaden your horizons too. Because I feel like the way that they're going right now, they're just trying to go head to head. Head to head's fine if you do it the way that I was talking about before, where you try and get the best fighters in the world and you can convince the world that you've got the best roster and things like that. But as long as the UFC just continues to build up big names like Makhachev, even McGregor is still somewhat relevant in the UFC right now. My mind is just going anywhere. Ilia Topuria is the most popular fighter in the world right now. Active fighter in the world anyway. Like, you've got to try and beat them in some ways. And I even think that the flyweight division could be a good example of it, because the UFC seems to ignore the flyweight division, even though it's so fun. Like, sign some really good flyweights, try and compete with them in flyweight. The UFC's heavyweight division is renowned to be incredibly weak, incredibly terrible. Everyone's talking about Gable Steveson going to the UFC. Can you try and get Gable Steveson for some reason? Or can you try and build up Poya Ramani to be this massive force that's going to be your version of that sort of high-level prospect, you know? Or even, I know that the PFL's doing this. They've actively been doing this for a long time. The next Bo Nickel. I know that the PFL failed the Bellator did actually fail to find the next Bo Nickel. They tried many different times. I think Bryce Meredith is an example of that, even though he's still been a very good prospect. He just never really built up that name value. Is he an example of it too? Maybe you can try and find the next Bo Nickel, try and captivate the world in that sort of area. I know that there's Olympic gold medalist wrestlers that are transitioning over to MMA, but like in their mid to late 30s. Why don't you just try and sign them? You know, even look at India. Why did I not bring up India? Dude, India had a superstar in Anshul Jabli, but he lost. Why don't you try and find any Indian fighters and build them up? Even if you have to can crush them a bit. That's a pretty good example of a market you can tap into. Matrix Fight Night. Is Matrix Fight Night still even around? I need to look into this. Like, actually a pretty fun promotion to watch as well, but this is a very successful company. Yes, they do. I haven't watched Matrix Fight Night in a while, but it's owned by the Shroff family, who are Bollywood stars. They haven't been crazy active, actually. That's why I haven't been too familiar with them. But they've got an event coming up. They've been waiting for a long time. The point is, India as well. India, Pakistan, Manchur Khan. Like, this would be a pretty good... Manchakira, sorry, would be a pretty good signing to the PFL, dude. Like, I know he is born and he is American, but he also is, I do believe, part Indian, part Pakistani, something along like that. Like, he would be a good example of someone you could sign and make a name out of, because he does still have that sort of heritage. I mean, like, these are what I mean. Like, this is what I mean as well in general. Like, I have no script. This is just off the dome. This is me yapping and chapping. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.